Bet $1 million, Ethan Walker said with a smug smile that carried across the crystal dining room. Because there is no chance a waitress like you can pull this off. The laughter arrived almost on cue. It rolled beneath the golden chandeliers, bounced off polished marble floors, and blended with the soft jazz drifting through the private dining hall of the Astoria Grand in downtown Chicago. Conversations paused. Expensive watches caught the warm light as guests slowly turned their heads toward the young woman standing beside the table with a silver serving tray resting steadily in her hands. Naomi Brooks didn't laugh. She didn't argue. She didn't lower her eyes. She simply looked at the billionaire as though the weight of his confidence meant nothing at all. That silence unsettled the room far more than any clever reply could have. Ethan Walker was accustomed to commanding attention without asking for it. At 38, the founder and CEO of Walker Dynamics had transformed a small engineering startup into one of America's fastest-growing technology companies. Business magazines praised his instincts. Investors admired his nerve. Employees respected his impossible standards. Winning had become such a constant part of his life that he no longer recognized the line separating confidence from arrogance. Tonight's private investor dinner was meant to celebrate another record-breaking acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Every guest represented influence. Every handshake could shape tomorrow's headlines. Yet somehow, the focus had shifted from billion-dollar negotiations to a woman whose name almost no one in the room had bothered to learn. Naomi Brooks had spent the evening moving quietly between tables, refilling sparkling water, replacing polished silverware, and anticipating requests before anyone spoke them aloud. She worked with the calm rhythm of someone who understood that excellence rarely announced itself. Most guests barely noticed her. A few snapped their fingers instead of saying, "Excuse me." Others thanked everyone except the people carrying the trays. None of it changed the gentle professionalism she carried with every step. Because long before she learned how to balance crystal glasses through crowded dining rooms, she had learned something far more valuable. Dignity is never handed to you. You protect it yourself. The challenge had started as an offhand joke during dessert. One investor mentioned that certain problems could only be solved by specialists with years of executive experience. Ethan laughed, glanced toward Naomi as she placed a coffee cup beside him, and casually suggested that if she could solve the same problem in under 60 seconds, he would personally hand her a $1 million check. More laughter followed. Someone whispered that the poor girl looked terrified. Another guest quietly reached for a phone beneath the table, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Naomi finally lifted her eyes to meet Ethan's. There was no anger inside them, no embarrassment, only remarkable composure. Then, with a calm voice that barely rose above the music, she asked one simple question. "Is that your final offer?" For the first time that evening, the laughter stopped. Naomi did not answer immediately. She simply set the polished silver tray onto a nearby service station with the same careful precision she had shown all evening, folded her hands together, and looked around the room instead of looking directly at Ethan Walker. Every face carried a different expression. Some wore amused smiles. Others expected embarrassment. A few investors leaned back in their chairs, curious to see how long this uncomfortable moment would last before the young waitress apologized and quietly returned to work. None of them realized they were no longer watching a wealthy executive control the room. They were watching someone else quietly take control without raising her voice. Ethan noticed it too, although he could not explain why. He had challenged hundreds of competitors across polished boardroom tables, negotiated billion-dollar contracts under impossible deadlines, and dismantled arguments with a confidence that had become legendary throughout the business world. Yet there was something unfamiliar about the woman standing a few feet away. She did not appear nervous. She did not appear eager to impress him. Most surprising of all, she did not seem interested in the $1 million. That puzzled him far more than confidence ever could. One of the investors broke the silence with an impatient laugh. "Come on," somebody said. "Either accept the challenge or walk away." The room filled with scattered chuckles again, although they sounded weaker than before. Naomi finally spoke. I only wanted to understand the rules. Fair rules make fair outcomes. Her voice was calm, steady, and almost impossible to interrupt. Ethan folded his arms with a smile that suggested the evening still belonged to him. The rules are simple, he replied. You have 60 seconds. No assistance. No second attempt. If you succeed, the money is yours. If you fail, everyone enjoys a good story over dessert. Several guests nodded approvingly. It sounded generous to them. It sounded impossible as well. Naomi listened carefully, without blinking. Then she asked another unexpected question. Will everyone here agree that the same rules apply to both of us? A subtle shift passed through the room. Some guests exchanged curious glances. One attorney, sitting near the end of the table, quietly lowered his coffee cup. An older investor who had remained silent all evening slowly smiled, as though he had finally recognized something others had missed. Ethan answered without hesitation. Of course. Equal rules. Equal opportunity. Naomi gave a small, respectful nod. Thank you, she said. That is all I needed to hear. Somewhere near the back of the private dining room, a server paused while carrying a tray of desserts. Even the pianist in the adjoining lounge seemed to drift into a softer melody as conversations throughout the restaurant faded beneath the growing tension inside the private hall. The phones that had quietly appeared beneath the tables were now fully raised. Nobody wanted to miss whatever happened next. They expected a waitress about to fail in spectacular fashion. They expected another entertaining story rich people would laugh about on the drive home. Instead, without anyone noticing, the balance of power had already begun to move, not because money had changed hands, but because one person had remained perfectly calm while everyone else had been distracted by confidence. The challenge was finally placed on the table. A senior investor reached into his leather briefcase, removed a sealed business envelope, and slid it toward Ethan. Inside was a single printed page that had arrived only an hour earlier from an engineering partner in Boston. It contained a manufacturing proposal with one critical flaw buried somewhere among rows of technical specifications, projected costs, delivery schedules, and compliance notes. The partner had promised an additional $100 million expansion if the mistake could be identified before contracts were signed the following morning. Ethan had already studied the document with his executive team before dinner. They had debated it for nearly 40 minutes without reaching complete agreement. That was why he smiled so confidently now. He believed there was no possibility that someone serving coffee and dessert could understand what experienced executives had failed to resolve. He placed the document carefully on the polished walnut table and turned it toward Naomi. You have exactly 60 seconds, he said. Find a mistake and explain why it matters. Nothing more, nothing less. A digital watch appeared beside the paper. One of the guests quietly activated the timer, while another adjusted a phone to record the moment from a better angle. The atmosphere shifted once again. Forks rested untouched beside half-finished desserts. Ice slowly melted inside untouched glasses of sparkling water. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago's skyline glowed against the deep blue evening sky, while traffic moved like streams of white and red light far below. Inside the private dining room, however, time seemed to slow. Naomi stepped closer to the table without touching the document. Instead of rushing, she observed everything around it first. She noticed the handwritten notes in the margin. She noticed the company logo printed at the top of the page. She noticed the signatures waiting at the bottom. Only then did she gently lift the proposal with both hands. She did not scan it from top to bottom the way most people expected. Her eyes moved with remarkable precision, pausing only for seconds before shifting to another section. Ethan watched with quiet amusement. In his mind, she was guessing. That assumption allowed him to relax. Across the table, however, an elderly investor named Harold Bennett leaned forward with growing curiosity. During 40 years of manufacturing, he had learned that true experts rarely hurried. They searched for patterns instead of answers. Naomi reached the final page with nearly half of her time remaining. She lowered the document, looked at the room, and then looked back at Ethan. She was still perfectly calm. The timer continued counting down. 40 seconds. 35. 30. No one breathed loudly enough to disturb the silence. Even the servers standing near the entrance had forgotten they were holding trays. Ethan smiled once more, convinced that hesitation had finally arrived. But what he mistook for uncertainty was something entirely different. Naomi was not searching for the answer anymore. She had already found it. She was deciding the simplest way to explain it, so that everyone in the room, from billionaire investors to restaurant staff, would understand exactly why one overlooked detail could change the value of an entire business deal. 20 seconds remained. No one moved. The digital timer glowed on the polished table like a silent heartbeat, while every pair of eyes stayed fixed on Naomi Brooks. She placed the proposal back onto the walnut surface with extraordinary care, smoothing the corner with her fingertips before speaking. "I do not believe the biggest problem is hidden inside the numbers," she said quietly. "I believe it is hidden inside the assumptions." Several guests exchanged puzzled looks. Ethan Walker let out a small laugh, confident that she had wandered away from the actual challenge. "This is an engineering proposal," he replied, "not a philosophy class." Naomi offered a polite smile. "Exactly. That is why everyone has been looking in the wrong place." She gently turned the final page toward the guest sitting nearest the document. "The manufacturing timeline promises full production in 90 days, she explained, tracing one line with her finger. "But the compliance certification listed on page 3 requires 120 days before commercial distribution under the current federal guidelines." The room grew noticeably quieter. Harold Bennett immediately leaned forward. Naomi continued before anyone interrupted. "Even if every machine performs perfectly, even if every supplier delivers on schedule, the products cannot legally enter the market until certification is complete. The delivery calendar and the regulatory timeline cancel each other out. That means the revenue forecast becomes impossible. Every projection after that point depends on a launch date that cannot happen." Ethan's smile faded almost imperceptibly. One executive quickly picked up the proposal and flipped through the pages. Another searched the compliance section with widening eyes. The attorney who had quietly observed the evening adjusted his glasses and began reading the referenced regulation twice. No one laughed now. Naomi remained composed, neither rushing nor celebrating. She simply waited while the room caught up to what she had already seen. Harold finally broke the silence. "Page 3, he whispered as he compared the certification schedule with the production calendar. Then his eyebrows lifted. "My goodness." He looked directly at Ethan. "She is correct." Another investor immediately opened a financial projection on his tablet and entered the revised launch date. Within seconds, several forecast columns changed color. Expected quarterly revenue dropped dramatically. Estimated expansion milestones shifted by months. One delayed certification had quietly unraveled an entire investment strategy worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The room filled not with panic, but with astonishment. The mistake had been sitting in plain sight the entire evening, overlooked because everyone had concentrated on complicated engineering formulas instead of the simple relationship between two conflicting schedules. Ethan stared at the proposal, then back at Naomi. For the first time that night, uncertainty appeared behind his confident expression. He had prepared for excuses, lucky guesses, even embarrassment. He had not prepared for clarity. Naomi folded her hands once more and spoke with the same calm respect she had shown from the beginning. "Sometimes the most expensive mistakes are not the hardest ones to solve. They're the ones everyone assumes someone else has already checked." The timer reached 0. A soft electronic tone echoed through the silent dining room. No one paid attention to it anymore. The real countdown had already ended the moment a woman almost everyone had underestimated transformed an impossible challenge into an unforgettable lesson about observation, humility, and the quiet power of paying attention. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The silence inside the private dining room felt heavier than every conversation that had filled it only moments before. Crystal glasses remained untouched. Dessert plates sat forgotten. Even the city lights beyond the towering windows seemed distant compared to the quiet unfolding around the polished table. Ethan Walker lowered his eyes to the proposal once again, reading the same paragraph for what must have been the fourth time. The words had not changed. The dates had not changed. Only his understanding had. Across from him, Harold Bennett slowly removed his reading glasses and placed them on the table. During 4 decades of manufacturing, he had reviewed thousands of contracts, negotiated international partnerships, and rescued companies from costly mistakes. Rarely had he witnessed a room full of experienced executives overlook something so fundamental. He looked toward Naomi with genuine admiration. "Where did you learn to notice details like that?" he asked. Naomi answered with the same quiet sincerity that had carried her through the evening. Waiting tables teaches you that people usually focus on what they expect to see. If you want to avoid mistakes, you have to pay attention to what everyone else ignores. Her answer settled over the room with unexpected weight. It was simple, honest, impossible to dismiss. One investor quietly nodded before closing his tablet. Another leaned back in his chair and smiled, not because he found the situation amusing, but because he had just witnessed something far more valuable than a clever answer. He had witnessed judgment without ego. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. Earlier that evening, every movement had projected authority. Now his posture carried something unfamiliar. Reflection. He reached for the envelope that still rested beside his plate and removed a personal check already signed with his name. Without making a speech, without searching for excuses, he wrote $1 million across the line and placed the check carefully in front of Naomi. "You earned this," he said quietly. "Not because you won a bet, because you prevented a mistake that would have cost far more than money." Several guests began applauding. It started with only 2 people. Then another joined. Within seconds, the entire room echoed with respectful applause that sounded completely different from the laughter that had filled the hall earlier. No one clapped out of sympathy. They applauded because excellence had revealed itself where they least expected to find it. Naomi looked at the check, but made no move to pick it up. Instead, she asked a question that surprised everyone once again. "Before I accept this, may I ask something?" Ethan nodded immediately. "Of course." Naomi glanced around the room before speaking. "If I had been wearing an expensive suit instead of this uniform, would anyone here have doubted I could solve it?" No one answered. They cannot. The question required no response because every person in the room already knew the truth. The applause faded into thoughtful silence. Some guests lowered their eyes. Others stared through the windows toward the Chicago skyline, replaying the evening inside their own minds. The greatest lesson had never been about engineering, contracts, or investment forecasts. It had been about assumptions. Assumptions built on appearance. Assumptions built on titles. Assumptions built on status. And in less than 1 minute, a woman who had entered the room carrying coffee cups had quietly dismantled every one of them. The question lingered in the room long after Naomi finished speaking. No one reached for a glass. No one checked a phone. For a gathering of people whose calendars were measured in minutes, and whose decisions often moved markets, the silence felt almost unfamiliar. Ethan Walker looked around the table and saw something he had rarely witnessed during executive meetings. Honest self-reflection. The confidence that had filled the room at the beginning of the evening had quietly given way to humility. Ethan took a slow breath before speaking again. "You are right," he admitted. "If you had walked in wearing a tailored business suit with an executive title beside your name, nobody would have questioned your ability for even a second." Several guests nodded in quiet agreement. There was no point pretending otherwise. The evidence had been sitting in front of them all evening. Naomi smiled gently, not because she had won, but because someone had finally spoken the truth aloud. "I appreciate your honesty," she replied. Then she looked at the check resting on the polished table. "Money was never the reason I accepted your challenge. I accepted because assumptions become expensive when nobody questions them." Harold Bennett leaned back with folded hands and quietly laughed, although this time it was filled with admiration rather than amusement. "That may be the best leadership lesson I have heard all year," he said. Another investor looked toward Ethan and added, "We spend millions every year teaching innovation, but innovation begins with listening to voices we almost ignored tonight." Ethan slowly picked up the check once more and held it in both hands. Then In front of everyone, he carefully folded it and placed it back inside the envelope. "I owe you the money," he said, "but I believe I owe you something even more important." Naomi tilted her head slightly, waiting without interrupting. Ethan continued, "Tomorrow morning my executive leadership team is reviewing every major expansion project scheduled for next year. I would like you to attend that meeting as my guest. Not as a server, not as an observer, as someone whose perspective deserves to be heard." A quiet wave of surprise moved through the room. Several executives looked at one another with raised eyebrows. Invitations into Walker Dynamics leadership meetings were rarely extended outside the company, especially to someone they had met only hours earlier. Naomi remained thoughtful before answering. "I am honored by the invitation," she said. "But if I come, I would expect everyone in that room to challenge my ideas the same way they challenge everyone else." Ethan smiled for the first time that evening without a trace of arrogance. "That is exactly why I want you there. Respect should never come from a title. It should come from the quality of what a person contributes." The room answered with another round of applause, softer this time, but somehow more meaningful. Even the restaurant manager, standing quietly near the entrance, found himself smiling with unmistakable pride. He had watched Naomi arrive early every morning, stay late every evening, and treat every guest with patience regardless of how she had been treated in return. Tonight the world had finally noticed what he had known for years. Excellence does not become valuable the moment people recognize it. It was valuable all along. Sometimes the only thing that changes is who finally chooses to see it. The dinner finally came to an end, but almost nobody seemed interested in leaving. Small conversations formed around every table, yet they all circled back to the same unexpected moment. Investors who had arrived expecting to celebrate another successful acquisition now found themselves discussing observation, humility, and the danger of overlooking quiet talent. Naomi Brooks returned to collecting empty glasses as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She thanked guests for their kindness, straightened chairs, and continued her work with the same steady professionalism she had shown before anyone knew her name. That simple decision impressed Ethan Walker more than the challenge itself. Most people who experience public recognition wanted the spotlight to linger. Naomi appeared more interested in finishing her shift than enjoying applause. As the last guest prepared to leave, Harold Bennett walked beside Ethan toward the elevator overlooking the Chicago skyline. "You know what surprised me the most tonight?" Harold said. Ethan expected him to mention the engineering proposal or the overlooked compliance schedule. But Harold simply smiled. "She never tried to embarrass you." Ethan paused before answering. "No, she did not." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "That is the difference between proving someone wrong and trying to make someone feel small. One builds trust. The other only builds pride." Those words stayed with Ethan long after Harold stepped inside the elevator. He watched the doors close, then turned back toward the dining room one final time. Naomi was helping another server carry a stack of folded table linens toward the service station. She moved with quiet purpose, smiling as she thanked a coworker for helping clear the last table. Nobody watching her now would guess she had just prevented a business mistake worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She carried herself exactly the same way she had before the challenge began. Ethan slowly walked across the nearly empty dining room until he reached the service station. Naomi looked up with a polite smile. "Is there anything else I can help you with this evening, sir?" she asked. Ethan shook his head gently. "Actually, yes. There's one thing. I would like to understand something." Naomi waited patiently. "Why did you never tell anyone about your background?" Ethan asked. Most people would have listed every accomplishment before accepting that challenge. Naomi smiled softly before answering. "Because people listen differently after they decide who you are. I wanted them to hear the idea before they judge the person." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. That single sentence explained the entire evening better than any business presentation ever could. As they spoke, one of the younger investors who had quietly recorded the challenge reviewed the video on his phone. Without adding dramatic music or exaggerated captions, he uploaded the short clip to a professional networking platform with a simple description. "Sometimes the smartest person in the room is the one nobody expected to notice." Within minutes, the first comments began appearing. Then dozens more. Then hundreds. Executives, engineers, educators, and entrepreneurs shared the story, not because someone had lost a bet, but because they recognized themselves in the lesson. Every workplace had overlooked someone. Every leader had made assumptions. Every organization had hidden talent waiting for a chance to be seen. And somewhere inside a quiet restaurant high above the lights of downtown Chicago, none of them realized that one respectful conversation had already begun reaching people far beyond the walls of that dining room. By sunrise the next morning, the story had traveled far beyond Chicago. What began as a quiet conversation inside an elegant private dining room had become the subject of thousands of discussions across boardrooms, classrooms, and offices throughout the country. The short video was only a few minutes long. There were no dramatic sound effects, no edited headlines, no sensational commentary. It simply showed a woman in a restaurant uniform calmly explaining a mistake that experienced executives had overlooked while a room full of influential people listened in complete silence. That authenticity was exactly why people believed it. Comments continued arriving by the minute. Engineers praised the importance of careful review. Teachers shared the video with students as an example of critical thinking. Managers admitted they had underestimated employees because of job titles rather than ability. One message appeared repeatedly beneath the video. Respect should never depend on a uniform. Inside Walker Dynamics headquarters, the atmosphere felt noticeably different from any ordinary morning. Executives gathered for the scheduled leadership meeting carrying printed copies of the revised proposal Naomi had corrected the night before. Instead of beginning with quarterly revenue forecasts, Ethan Walker opened the meeting by placing the engineering document in the center of the conference table. "We almost approved this exactly as it was," he said honestly. Several department heads exchanged uncomfortable glances. They had all reviewed the proposal before dinner. Ethan continued without assigning blame. "This mistake survived because every one of us trusted assumptions more than observation. That changes today." He then described everything that had happened at the restaurant, leaving out none of his own mistakes. The room remained remarkably quiet. Finally, the chief operating officer spoke. "If someone outside our company noticed this in less than a minute, perhaps we need to reconsider how we identify talent inside our own organization." Heads nodded around the table. Ethan smiled slightly. "That is exactly why we are waiting for our first guest this morning." A few minutes later, the conference room doors opened. Naomi Brooks entered wearing a simple navy blue business suit she had borrowed from her older sister. She carried no expensive briefcase, no impressive presentation folder, and no expectation beyond keeping the promise she had made the previous evening. She wanted her ideas judged on their value rather than her appearance. Several executives stood to greet her. The same people who had questioned her ability only hours earlier now introduced themselves with genuine respect. Harold Bennett, attending as an advisor, quietly watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. He recognized something larger than a successful meeting. He was witnessing a culture beginning to change. Ethan invited Naomi to sit beside the executive team instead of across from them. Before anyone opened a laptop or reviewed a financial report, he addressed the room with unusual sincerity. "Today we are not adding a consultant. We are adding a perspective we almost ignored. If we want better decisions, we must become better listeners." Naomi looked around the conference table at faces that now showed curiosity instead of certainty. She realized the greatest victory from the previous evening had never been the check, the applause, or even the invitation. The real victory was that an entire room of accomplished leaders had become willing to question their own assumptions, and that was a change worth far more than $1 million. The meeting ended without celebration, yet everyone leaving the conference room understood they had witnessed something they would remember for years. The revised proposal moved forward with a stronger strategy. The overlooked compliance issue was corrected before a single contract was signed, and what could have become a costly mistake became an example that would later be shared throughout Walker Dynamics as part of leadership training. Weeks passed, but the story refused to fade. Recruiters began reviewing hiring practices with fresh eyes. Managers started asking quieter employees for their opinions before final decisions were made. New mentoring programs appeared inside departments that had once focused only on titles and resumes. The change did not happen because one company wanted good publicity. It happened because one unexpected moment had exposed a truth that was impossible to ignore. Ethan Walker kept the original engineering proposal framed inside his office, not as a reminder of success, but as a reminder of humility. Whenever visitors asked why a marked-up business document occupied such a visible place on the wall, he always answered the same way. That piece of paper reminds me that intelligence does not introduce itself with expensive clothing or impressive job titles. Sometimes it arrives carrying a serving tray. Naomi Brooks accepted Ethan's invitation to continue advising the company on selected projects while remaining committed to finishing the business degree she had been pursuing through evening classes for several years. She never asked for a corner office. She never requested special treatment. She simply continued doing what she had always done. She prepared carefully. She listened closely. She asked thoughtful questions. Before long, people stopped introducing her as the waitress from the restaurant. They introduced her by something far more meaningful. They called her the woman whose perspective saved an entire investment. Harold Bennett often smiled whenever he heard that description because he knew the Real story reached much deeper than one successful business decision. The greatest achievement had not been finding an error hidden inside a proposal. It had been revealing the invisible assumptions hidden inside people. Those assumptions had quietly influenced conversations, opportunities, and judgments for years. Once they became visible, they could finally begin to change. On a cool autumn evening several months later, Ethan returned to the Astoria Grand for another private dinner with investors. The same chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. The same piano filled the room with gentle music. The same skyline stretched beyond the windows. Yet something was unmistakably different. Every member of the staff was greeted by name. Every server was thanked with genuine respect. Every question received patient attention. Small changes, perhaps, but meaningful ones. As Ethan prepared to leave, he noticed a young employee training on the restaurant floor. The new server looked nervous while carrying a tray of sparkling water toward an important table. Ethan smiled warmly and thanked the young man before accepting his glass. Naomi happened to witness the quiet exchange from across the room. Their eyes met for only a moment before they exchanged a respectful nod. No words were necessary. They both understood that the greatest victories are rarely measured by money, applause, or headlines. They are measured by the people who choose to become better after learning an unexpected lesson. Ethan once believed $1 million was enough to measure someone's worth. That night taught him otherwise. Wealth can open doors. Authority can command attention. Success can fill a room. But dignity, humility, and quiet excellence possess a value that no check can ever purchase, because the strongest people are not always the loudest in the room. Sometimes they are simply the ones who never stop seeing what everyone else overlooks.